Merry Christmas, written by USA Today bestselling author Lexy Timms, copyright 2023 by Lexy Timms, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Coulson was on his third drink of hot cocoa and marshmallows. They'd spent the evening talking together in her living room, mostly in conversation about work-related stuff. But there had been an electrifying undercurrent to the conversation as she'd leaned in to speak, her knee occasionally bumping against his. The spicy scent of her perfume pushing him to the brink of desire, so much so that he'd gulped down 3 mugs of chocolate to keep from reaching out and kissing her. Those warm brown eyes of hers had drawn him in for so long that he'd lost track of time, though he guessed it was after midnight. Way too late for a friendly visit to a woman's place, but Coulson was reluctant to leave. Suddenly her hand was on his knee. "I'm really glad you came out with me tonight." "Thanks for the invite," he said, placing his mug on the coffee table. "I don't usually get asked to festive things, though I think there's going to be payback for you tricking me." "Trick you? I would never do such a thing. What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning innocence, her eyelashes fluttering. Coulson laughed. "Come on. You must have known that caroling in the dead of winter is the last thing I'd willingly sign up for." "It is pretty crazy to go out when it's so cold, but it's tradition," she said. "Freezing your ass off is tradition." Blair laughed softly, her hand still on his knee. "Yes, so is sharing a warm drink with a friend." "You often invite friends over at this hour to share a drink?" he asked, his tone turning serious. "Friends? Yes. Clients? No," she said, sounding breathless as she seemed to realize they were touching and proceeded to snatch her hand from his knee. Blair pulled her hand back while somehow also leaning closer. He noticed the way the fabric of her sweater accentuated the rise of her breasts when she moved. Coulson felt his body tense as she drew near. He struggled to remember that he had to keep his hands to himself. While the sensual heat of her body slid over him, he struggled to remember everything else as well, including how to breathe. "I'm both, Blair," he reminded her, his gaze dropping to her pink mouth as she licked the chocolate away. Hell, everything about her aroused him. The full sweep of her bottom lip made him want to groan. "Well, this is a first for me," she said, her voice low and husky. "I've never really befriended a client." The corners of her mouth tugged down into a momentary frown, and then they curved back up again as she smiled suddenly, like she had come to a realization. The smile was playful, her teeth gently biting down on her bottom lip. Yeah, something definitely shifted in her. Maybe his reminder of how complicated their relationship was had brought her to a decision that he couldn't quite decipher. That playful smile reached her eyes, the warmth in them burning brighter until he thought he saw an imitation in them. "You said you were going to punish me for tricking you." There was another flash in her eyes, a flicker of desire that he recognized. "What sort of payback did you have in mind, anyway?" Truthfully, he hadn't quite phrased it like that. Coulson had been teasing her earlier, so he hadn't expected her to twist his desire for payback into something that was less than wholesome, because it was pretty obvious what she was getting at, and he was too intrigued to put a stop to it. This was turning into that moment before the second kiss underneath the mistletoe, except now there wasn't any mistletoe. There wasn't any mistletoe to blame for the tension that pushed him to stretch his arm out on the back of the sofa, a subtle appeal to put his arm around her. Only he was holding himself back from actually touching her. Coulson didn't want to push Blair, despite the desire that was raging through him, because this didn't feel like they were headed towards some chaste kiss that was meant to be a joke. He couldn't laugh this off or act like it didn't mean anything. His heart was beating too fast for him to pull off that lie. This was one of those moments where he had to let the woman lead. Blair was in the driver's seat. Cocky as it sounded, he had always thought it best to let women to throw themselves at him, which they always did eventually, even though the most aloof society debutantes ended up begging him to take them to bed in the end. It was taking all his willpower to hold himself back. The strain of the effort made him sweat. Right now he wanted to beg Blair to end the torture and touch him, anywhere on his body. At this point, he didn't really care where. "You should be the one to decide your punishment," he finally managed to choke out. Pretty soon he'd be too aroused to form words. Her eyes widened a fraction, and then the warm brown turned dark and sultry, How about instead of choosing my own punishment, I reward you instead? His temperature soared, and his collar suddenly felt tight around his neck. Reward? Yes, a reward for sticking it out and going caroling in the freezing weather, she said. Rewards are much better than punishment this time of year, don't you think? Yeah, I think so. Coulson swallowed hard. He felt the blood rush southward. There was a desperate ache in his groin, and he knew the tension would slowly kill him if she didn't touch him soon. What did you have in mind? She edged closer, the spicy scent of her perfume getting stronger. That mouth-watering fragrance of cloves and cinnamon was driving him insane. Blair lifted a hand to brush his hair out of his face so she could stare deep into his eyes. Her hand was still in his hair when she said, This. I want this. There wasn't any hesitation, no pause to say more. All she did was inhale gently before pressing her soft lips to his. An electrical charge shot through him the moment they made contact. The heat of her mouth was enough to make his mind splinter. Logic went out the window now that he had her mouth crushed beneath his. All the warnings in his head disintegrated. Common sense wasn't going to apply in this situation. This was the worst idea imaginable. Mixing business with pleasure. But the need for pleasure with Blair outweighed whatever sound judgment was left in him. More heat surged through him, her mouth hot as iron in a fireplace. There was no coming back from this. He'd be crazy to want to come back from this anyway. Ravenous for more, he pried her lips apart with his tongue. Easily dumb because her mouth was so pliant that she welcomed him in with a moan. Damn, she tasted so good. Sweet as marshmallows, decadent as cocoa. The flavor exploded on his tongue. If he didn't get a hold of himself, he'd be in danger of devouring her. His cloudy thoughts became clearer. Against every single instinct, every desire to possess her, he stopped. Tore his mouth away so that she could catch her breath while he got the words out. Blair, we go as fast or slow as you want, he said raggedly. I don't expect anything. I'm signing the contract no matter what happens next, okay? Okay, she breathed heavily, her entire body shaking. I've tried to resist for so long. Coulson shut his eyes for a second, gulping air into his lungs. Why? Your family, for one, she said. I don't want to come between you and your family. She said as much days earlier, but now it didn't feel like rejection. Instead, it felt like she was denying herself what she really wanted out of some misguided belief that it would make him happy. It wouldn't, because he needed her. I get it if you want to keep resisting and put a stop to things before they get out of hand, he said, dying on the inside. Ending things now was the last thing he wanted, but he had to respect her wishes, even if his cock ached. I thought I could keep pretending that there was nothing between us, but then you asked if I often invited people over at this hour, and the answer is no. I haven't had a guy over in ages, she admitted. Because it's been a long time since I met a guy who makes me feel the way you make me feel, Coulson. Stunned as he was at her confession, he understood the emotions behind every word. Truth was, he'd never met anyone who made him feel alive the way Blair did. With her, he felt like a new man. Felt like all the expectations he'd been burdened with all his life didn't have to matter. None of it seemed to matter when she treated him like a person, and not like he was just the golden initials on a monogram. While she had been nervous about his family name, Blair had taken the time to get to know who he was, and she'd done all that without playing games, or acting aloof, or putting up with his BS. She wasn't impressed by externals. All she cared about was what was inside. Unfortunately for him, he was plagued by doubts on the inside. As close as they had been getting during the past couple of weeks, a part of Coulson wondered if crossing that line was a good idea. They couldn't pursue anything serious. This would be a casual hookup at best, yet what he felt for her wasn't casual. The urge to protect her proved that his feelings were deeper than simple attraction, and he did feel the need to protect her, even in this small town. For one thing, the pressure of high society had a way of piercing through idealism. So, despite Blair's refusal to be impressed by his last name, He knew that there were pressures that she hadn't experienced. Blair might not have been naive about the world, but unless someone had lived under the crushing weight of high society expectations, they had no idea how dangerous it was to have wants and needs that were separate from upper-class norms. Blair made him feel like anything was possible, and something that unexpected set him on edge. Before meeting her, he'd never felt as if things could change, because nothing had ever changed. Rigid rules always won. Sooner or later, high society would make everybody bend to its will. But Blair had given him hope for the first time, given him an understanding that relationships could be built on something more than wealth and status. Relationships didn't have to be like soulless corporate mergers. This was the opposite of soulless, and he'd never experienced that before, which terrified him. He was in uncharted territory now, a realization that was so dangerous he worried that their inevitable separation would end up making her feel like he'd been leading her on, despite not meaning to make her feel that way at all. If he acted on his fantasies, what the hell would he do when they both crashed back down to earth? He stared into her eyes. Damn it, Blair. I've never wanted a woman as much as I want you right now, but... I know what you're doing, she interrupted, lifting a finger to his lips. Don't try to talk me out of this. I don't want to be talked out of this. Now, if you're refusing me, that's something else entirely. Hell no. I could never turn you down. What man could? He smiled against her touch. She traced her finger against his mouth, her touch reawakening his desire. They don't have to know, do they? Your family? They don't have to know what we do tonight. They don't have to know, he repeated. Good. Blair pulled her finger away, replacing it with her mouth on his. Her mouth was a revelation to him, soft and yielding, lush and ripe. Her lips so pliant against the thrust of his tongue that he could barely believe this was the same woman who hated the town's kissing tradition. She kissed as if she was made for kissing. Blair was surrendering to the sensation that words could never express. Wantonly, without restraint, in her kiss he could sense that she wasn't holding back anymore. That spurred him on. He didn't want to hold back either. Coulson wanted to give her everything. All of him, even if it was just for a night. Heat flared where their lips touched, a fire blasting through him. Blair responded to him with a greedy, passionate abandon, her tongue meeting his in a sensual tangle. A low moan escaped her as she circled her arms around his shoulders. Arms wrapped around him, she started to draw him closer. Coulson obliged, leaning in to intensify the kiss. He was about to reach out and draw her against him too, but she was suddenly sitting in his lap. His arousal was instantaneous. Desire rushed to his head and much lower to his cock at the exact same time, resulting in a raging hard-on to go with the intoxication that was spinning in his head. The desire transformed into something feral as the heat of her body burned him through his clothes. He felt her thighs and the curve of her backside against his crotch as she squirmed in his lap. Damn, this was killing him. If he didn't have her soon, his arousal would bring him to his knees. Mercifully, she seemed to sense his desperation for her because she ended the kiss to slip out of his lap. Blair rose to her feet. The sofa isn't big enough for the two of us. It definitely wasn't large enough to do what he wanted to do to her. She extended her hand and he took it, letting her tug him into an embrace, followed by a continuation of their kiss. Taking her mouth with his, Coulson lowered his arms, one hand touching the small of her back, the other finding the indentation above the flare of her hip on the way to encircling her waist. He felt her quiver, her entire body reacting to him. Blair's lips parted again, surrendering to the onslaught of his tongue. A low moan escaped her as she started to move, heading for the living room exit. Coulson let her lead him through the apartment, lips still connected, the pair of them stumbling down the well-lit hallway, only stopping when her back was against a door at the end of the hallway. Blair ended the kiss to open the door and step inside. Then she reached out to pull him into her bedroom. They were in her bedroom, lips locked, fumbling in the semi-dark. Stretching her hand out desperately, Blair's fingertips grazed the walls, searching in the dimness while her eyes were closed as they resumed the most incredible kiss of her life. The glow of the overhead light barely registered when she found the switch and flicked it on. All she cared about was getting into bed with Coulson. There was a voice in the back of her head yelling at her, shouting at her to stop. Blair had been listening to that voice for weeks now. She was tired of obeying it. That was why she'd ended up in Coulson's arms. She'd invited him over with every intent on resisting her own desire. But then they'd started talking and joking and flirting. All her life she had followed a sensible path. First college, then opening her own store. No distractions. Definitely not distractions of the male variety, no matter how much her family pressured her to find a husband. Unfortunately, there was now a fork in the path. She could keep going in the direction she'd always planned, or she could take a detour and see where it led. At the very least, she could experience the pleasure she'd been denying herself all this time. While she didn't regret focusing on her dreams, she realized that she had neglected other dreams of connections and relationships and passion. For heaven's sake, she hadn't had sex in ages, and if she couldn't indulge in pleasure during the holidays, then when could she? Breathless, she wrenched her mouth away, taking a moment to gaze up at him. "Do you want this?" she asked him. The answer was a wicked flash in his green eyes, a devilish grin taking over. Her pulse quickened. "More than anything," he said, his voice low and seductive. He dragged a thumb across her mouth, following the motion with another kiss that sent a thrill through her entire being. They tumbled down onto her bed together, their lips locked again, his greedy hands all over her body the moment she landed on her back. The heat of his touch burned through the thick fabric of her skin-tight sweatpants. He was on top of her now, his knee nudging her legs apart as she reached for the zipper of his hoodie. This was a terrible idea, a lapse in judgment that she knew would come back to bite her. But right now, good sense was the last thing on Blair's mind. What she wanted was to finally fulfill the desire that had been tormenting her for weeks. If she didn't give in to temptation now, that need would only get worse, until it wound up being too intense to ever satisfy. She needed this, needed him. From the way he was exploring her with his tongue, Coulson needed this too. Blair pulled down the zipper. More heat spread through her, the warmth traveling upwards as he dragged one hand up her quivering thigh, the other hand possessively gripping her waist. The kiss turned carnal, his tongue caressing hers. She felt the place between her legs throb in time to the strokes of his tongue. Then her heart started beating the exact same rhythm. Her entire body was humming. Coulson's mouth was so demanding against hers, hungry and insistent as he masterfully devoured her with his tongue. Between the slide of his tongue against hers and the weight of his hard body on top of her, the kiss was dizzying. Blair didn't want this to end, and yet she wanted more, needed more. Her hands found his hair again, and she gripped the dark locks tightly, holding on for dear life as Coulson swept her away. When he tore his sensuous mouth from hers, she almost cried out in protest, but his lips were soon on her again as he started to kiss along her collarbone. He left a trail of fiery kisses across her throat, then along her jawline. The heat of his firm mouth was like a brand against skin. She trembled as he kissed her, the sensation of his lips on her flesh sending her into a frenzy. Without needing to think at all, her body responded to him. Her back arched as she desperately tried to get even closer to him, Blair wishing she could be rid of the fabric separating them. "Clothes. Off. Now," she said, gasping out the demand. Coulson laughed, pressing his lips to the corner of her mouth. "Patience, darling." Oh, he was doing this on purpose, tormenting her as payback for tricking him earlier. There was no use complaining as he took his sweet time kissing her down the column of her neck, by which point she was panting. Then and only then did he sit up to focus his attention on her clothes. As he started to unbutton her sweater, she felt her breasts strain against the fabric, her nipples hardening. He undid every button, exposing her to his hungry gaze. Finally, he was able to slide her sweater off, stripping her down to her bra. Thank goodness she had worn matching panties today. Sometimes she just reached into her underwear drawer and pulled out the first item she got her hands on. Thankfully, she had put in effort today, choosing a matching set, burgundy and slightly sheer because of the lace. She paused to glance at him, noting the lustful gleam in his eye. That made her blush. If he'd looked at her like that in a public place, everyone would know what was on his mind. His desire was unmistakable. Coulson forced out a ragged breath. Blair, you are so gorgeous. I've wanted you like this since the day I first saw you. Blair was unraveling too quickly to know what to say next. What could she even say when a man wanted her that much? It wasn't something she had experienced in a long time. Without needing an exchange of words, Coulson lowered his mouth to her, kissing the rise of her breasts. When his lips brushed against the skin right above the lacy fabric, she inhaled sharply, stunned that something that brief and inconsequential could send so many sparks through her. He reached behind her, expertly unhooking her bra in seconds. Now she really was exposed to him. This time, Coulson's jaw clenched as he gritted his teeth. In his eyes, she glimpsed his raw, animalistic need for her. She'd never seen anything like it. This was desire in its most explosive form, and for a moment, she wondered if he was going to pounce on her. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, he choked out, looking like he was doing everything in his power to restrain himself against his own desire. All that bravado was gone. He wasn't so cocky anymore, seeming to forget that he had tried to torment her earlier by taking his time. Don't you want to see the rest of me? She asked, her face heating as she threw down a bold challenge. It wasn't like her to be bold, but then Coulson's honest reaction had brought it out of her. Shy as she felt, she wasn't going to let this chance go to waste. Under his gaze, she felt desirable enough to be brazen, to be herself, to give in to the side of her she had kept locked away for so long. You know I do. I want to see all of you. He gripped the waistband of her sweatpants, quickly peeling them off. She was down to nothing but the smallest pair of panties. Sweat formed on his brow as he lowered his gaze to the flimsy burgundy lace. From the hungry look in his eyes, it was clear that Coulson wanted her underwear gone. Instead of waiting for him to finally undress her, Blair reached down and decided to grant his wish. She yanked her panties off, her heart pounding when she lay on the bed completely naked. Coulson reached out to caress her thigh, the weight of his large hand setting her on fire. You're perfect, Blair. Perfect. He started to kiss a trail up her inner thigh, making her breath hitch as his lips pressed against the sensitive skin. She shivered. You know, I'd like to see you too, she said, catching a breath long enough to confess her desire. His response was an arrogant smile. Of course you do. And she almost rolled her eyes, but he was already pulling back to tug off his hoodie, revealing a perfectly sculpted torso. His muscles rippled as he tossed the hoodie aside. Then he got off her bed to take off the other layers of clothes, leaving nothing but his boxer briefs. That telltale bulge made her swallow hard. Blair felt the throb between her legs, a clear sign that her body ached to be with him. He was incredible, every part of him hard and chiseled. Following the planes of his body, she took him in slowly. Wide shoulders, defined biceps, a solid wall of chest, and toned calves. Coulson really was the epitome of masculine beauty. He caught her staring at him, and he grinned. Speechless? That was one way to put it. At that moment, she was far too aroused to form any clear thoughts, to think she was going to have this man all to herself. Still too overcome to speak, she beckoned for him to rejoin her on the bed. He got down on his side, his grin still evident. I'm nervous, she confessed. I won't bite, he returned smoothly, desire blazing in his eyes. For the record, I'm nervous as well. Really? Why? I want to impress you, he admitted. She let her gaze slide over to the bulge in his boxer briefs. Unable to help herself, Blair licked her lips. You already have. Taking charge, she reached out to frame his face between her hands, tilting her head as she leaned in for another kiss. Coulson seized her mouth, moving in to lower his body onto hers. Feeling more brazen, she wrapped her legs around him, drawing him in even closer. Soon, she'd be able to satisfy weeks of pent-up desire. She'd give in to her lust this one time, and once it was sated, Blair would be back to her sensible self. No more pining over him. No more wondering what it would be like to indulge in exploring that hard body. Tonight was special because she'd be able to drink her fill without becoming addicted. Resisting him had only made her crave him more, and now that she was surrendering, she'd finally be rid of the lust that had been simmering between them. Then they could return to their professional relationship and then go their separate ways once Christmas was over. All thoughts of her sensible plan melted away the moment he slipped his tongue past her teeth. One kiss, and she was already delirious. Desperate for more intimate contact, Blair started to grind against him slowly, her tongue mating with his as he deepened the kiss. Still half delirious, she reached down, hand sliding down the hard expanse of his back to start lowering his boxer briefs. That was when she felt the thick bulge of his erection through the fabric. Liquid heat pulled between her thighs when she realized how hard he was. She moaned, the needy sound swallowed by his demanding kiss. Blair arched her back, impatient for him. Her mind started spinning as passion took over. When was the last time she had felt like this? Not the last time she'd had sex. The last time the buildup had felt this good. She couldn't remember. Maybe it had never been this amazing before. Everything before tonight was a quick fumble in comparison to all the attention that Coulson was showing her. Wait. Her eyes widened as she suddenly remembered. We need protection. Coulson swore under his breath, then rolled away from her. Damn it, I've got nothing. So this means we're going to have to keep our hands to ourselves, or I make a speed run to a store at this hour. No way. I can't wait that long, she interrupted, scrambling across the bed to her nightstand. On second thought, we could stick to using our hands, he laughed. Wouldn't mind having your hands on me. Hang on. What are you doing? Blair opened the top drawer. There had been that awkward one-night stand several months ago with the guy who never called her back. She reached into the drawer, then held up the wrapper triumphantly. I knew there were condoms in here. Is this another one of those Christmas miracles? He asked with a straight face before grinning at her. That made her laugh. I think it counts. Coulson came closer, the weight of his large muscular body shifting the mattress beneath them. When he was near enough to touch, she felt his heat. That heat ignited her lust. The place between her legs throbbed, desperation tearing through her as she held the condom out to him. He took a second to strip out of his boxer briefs, baring himself for her scrutiny. Blair almost gasped, stunned by the length and girth of his erection. From the base of his shaft to the engorged tip, he was huge and hard and perfect. Blair's face heated at the sight. Then she blushed even harder as he took the condom from her, opened the foil wrapping, and slid the latex on. Damn, she craved him so intensely that it was starting to feel like a physical ache. Come here. She had meant the order to sound like a take-charge command, but it had come out as a desperate plea. Bold as she wanted to be, seeing him in all his glory was more than a little intimidating, not to mention thrilling. Had she been with a guy that big before? Blair didn't think so. Coulson moved closer to cover her body with his. All that muscular hardness weighing down on her made her feel so small compared to him. And yet, she also felt safe in his presence. She instinctively spread her legs for him. Ready for me, Blair? He asked her. Yes. Ready for me? She asked, arching her eyebrow before she looked up into his eyes. Yeah, you know I am. He kissed her gently, warming her mouth with his, and then, with her body going warm all over, Coulson thrust into her tight, wet heat. When he entered her, Blair felt the first sparks of pleasure spiral through her body. The force of it stole her breath away, and she threw her arms around him, held him tightly to her as they both crested on the first wave of pleasure together. Coulson broke the kiss and groaned, his forehead on hers. A stray lock of his hair feathered against her skin, the strands soft and silky. Blair inhaled, taking in the piney scent that always seemed to radiate from him. Her lungs were full of that scent, a sign that no part of her body would be left unchanged by this. Their eyes met once more, his impossibly green gaze drawing her in, pulling her into an evergreen forest. At first his gaze was comforting, her body cooling as she held on, enduring the sweet ache of that initial thrust. But then she felt as if she was coming undone. Her body's reaction to his wild and out-of-control pleasure threatened to draw her to an early climax, cutting short her chance at bliss. Disappointment mingled with her pleasure, and she was anxious about losing her chance to truly share this moment with him. Blair wanted him so badly she could scarcely breathe. "Blair!" He choked out her name, the single syllable ragged and tender all at once. "Are you okay?" The question made her feel so safe that her heart squeezed tightly. Somehow, in that wild primal vortex of pleasure, she remembered that she was protected underneath him. No matter how forceful the pleasure was, there was no danger in giving into it, as long as she held on to Coulson. This moment between them would last. "Yes," she gasped out. "Are you?" "I'm more than okay, sweetheart," he said with a laugh before he took her mouth with his for a brief kiss. The term of endearment melted her heart. He thrust into her again, ecstasy rushing through her body as they found their own rhythm. At first his strokes were slow yet powerful, a steady spiral of unending pleasure. Blair raised her hips to meet each thrust, taking him deeper and deeper into her. Every time she clenched around him, Coulson exhaled a low, guttural groan. Soon they were both breathing heavily, the steady rhythm turning frantic as they both sought release. Ecstasy seized her whole body, the punishing pace of his strokes pushing her to the brink of euphoria. Blair had never experienced pleasure this intense. It seemed to reverberate through her entire body, her entire being, until the sensation echoing through her wrapped around her heart, and she could feel the muscles swell in her chest. Blair's fingernails dug into his shoulders, eliciting another groan from him. As she tried to catch her breath, she saw the exertion on his face. His features twisted into a grimace, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead, making his hair stick to his skin. The expression on his face betrayed his true feelings: exhaustion, strain, tension, and all-encompassing pleasure. He buried his head in her hair, groaning that pleasure against her ear as his thrusts grew even more forceful. Ecstasy rippled through her, starting at her core, then expanding beyond the limits of her body. Blair had experienced pleasure before, but she had never experienced anything like this. She whimpered, her entire body trembling as he rocked into her, pleasure gripping them both. Despite the force of his thrust, she felt his strength ebb as exhaustion set in, his strokes slowing after giving her everything he had. At that moment, she came hard, her climax overtaking her. Blair flung her head back, moaning his name. He thrust into her one last time, groaning so loudly she knew that he had come too. Then he collapsed on top of her, both of them drenched in sweat, breathing too heavily to speak. Coulson gathered her in his arms, pulling her close enough for Blair to place her cheek against his hard chest. She heard the wild pounding of his heartbeat. He was just as exhausted, worn out, and sated as she was. Before she could ask him how he was, she felt him press a kiss to her damp forehead, and then she was drifting off to peaceful sleep. Blair awoke some time later to the jarring sound of a ringing cell phone. Blinking, she looked over at Coulson and found him scrambling out of bed. He was completely naked, and part of her was so pleased to see him in a state of undress that it took a second for her to notice that he was getting his phone from the pocket of his pants. Answering quickly, he said, "Yes?" Curious about who could possibly be calling him at this hour, Blair sat up, wrapping her arms around herself out of modesty. If she got a little extra time to go back to sleep, she'd get up early to make him pancakes, seasonally appropriate ones made with delicious tart cranberries. Whoever it was on the phone, Coulson didn't seem too pleased. His eyebrows were furrowed, and though he spoke in a low tone, his voice sounded strained. "Everything okay?" she asked after he hung up. "I have to go," he responded, picking up his clothes off the floor. Her heart sank. Everything had seemed so perfect. What had gone wrong? Before she could ask further questions, Coulson disappeared into the adjacent bathroom. He came back out a minute later, fully dressed, a troubled look on his handsome face. "Do you want to tell me what's going on?" she asked, gently but firmly. "I'm sorry, Blair. I wish I could stick around, but I can't," he said. "Why, it's not like I'm kicking you out. If anything, I want you to stay," she admitted. "I gotta head back to the house," he said, his jaw clenching. "Hate to cut this short, but I need to go. I just got a call from my father. He's in town."